It is exactly 18 hours before Pompeii disappears beneath the ashes in the year 79 AD, and the baker, Marcus, makes the most routine decision of his life. He sets the oven to 644 degrees Fahrenheit and lines up the dough for 81 loaves of bread to rise. He has no idea that the city's clock has just stopped. 1930 years later, excavations would open this very chamber, revealing each petrified piece of food, with the artisan's stamp still intact on the crust. What this meal, paralyzed by relentless heat, exposes is not just the fury of a volcano. The true mystery proves how the destiny of 11,000 people was sealed in the small details, in the perfectly blind choices of an ordinary morning. Just moments before the sky fell down, the smell of warm bread should have been the first memory of that morning on the 24th of August. As the baker, Marcus, closed the heavy iron door of his oven, the sunlight began to illuminate the paved streets of Pompeii. This was not a city of silent stones and ruins, as time has conditioned us to see. It was a pulsing, vibrant, and loud metropolis. 11,000 people were waking up to another day of work, to free trade, to business deals, and to mundane routines. Clean, fresh water flowed continuously through the imposing Sereno aqueduct. It fed 89 public fountains scattered throughout the busiest neighborhoods. On the street corners, merchants were already opening the sturdy wooden doors of their shops in the Great Forum. They organized their goods while listening to the heavy sound of wagon wheels clattering against the cobblestones. Everything was exactly in its proper place. And it is precisely in this absolute normality that the darkest part of what was to come truly lies. When we look at the disappearance of the city in the year 79 AD, we tend to focus only on the mountain that cracked the sky and blotted out the sun. But the true weight of this history, the part that truly catches our breath, is not found in the brute force of the volcano. It is found in the silent tragedy of routine, in the ordinary decisions made by normal people, people who, without the slightest awareness, walked blindly toward an irreversible end. What we are going to reconstruct from this moment on is not the geological collapse. We are going to retrace the steps of these families. During the final 18 hours of the city of Pompeii, we will walk into the commercial bakeries, the grand amphitheater, and the hallways of their homes. We will observe up close every mundane decision that defined their destinies long before the first rock fell upon the roofs. Today, we look at the plaster casts of those bodies, and we see only the final paralysis, but each of those positions tells the story of a choice made hours earlier, a choice about staying behind to protect their wealth, about climbing up to the second floor in search of false safety, or about simply trying to keep living against all odds under the shadow of a danger that no one understood. And as we walk together through these ancient streets and reconstruct this timeline, please let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We want to know our followers. We want to see how far our history reaches, and we truly love replying to every single comment. Now, to understand how everything began to crumble, we need to go back in time. We need to return to the late afternoon of the day before, to a moment when the first and most lethal of all illusions was already perfectly settled over the city, because the countdown had already begun, and absolutely no one on the streets of Pompeii was able to hear it. The year is 1930. The modern world is rushing forward out there, but in southern Italy, under the heavy sun of the Campania region, a group of excavators is working in complete silence. Their tools cut through the petrified earth with an almost surgical care. They are operating in the ruins of Region 7 of Pompeii, clearing the grayish debris from an ancient commercial structure. It is in this setting of dust and stones that the daylight touches for for the first time in nearly 2 millennia, the iron door of an intact brick oven. Have you ever felt that chill down your spine when you realize you have found something that time tried to hide? That exact moment when the past seems somehow to look right back at you? That was exactly the atmosphere that took hold of the workers as they opened that heavy, sealed door. Inside, lined up with a mathematical and terrifying precision, rested 81 loaves of bread. They were not crushed. They were not deformed by the weight of the earth. They were perfectly whole, charred right to the core, transformed into dark stones by time and by a relentless wave of heat. This was the famous oven of Modestus, one of the busiest bakeries in the entire city. And what makes this discovery so deeply unsettling is not the food itself, but the historical weight that it carries. Each of those loaves had a stamp, a raised mark engraved on the crust, indicating the artisan's name and guaranteeing the product's origin. It was a common system of daily organization. 81 families in Pompeii sat at their tables that morning. They talked, they planned their chores, and they waited for a hot meal that never arrived. Modern archaeology has revealed an even deeper detail to us, something that connects us directly to the human side of that morning. A meticulous analysis of the dough's internal structure and the fossilized grains proved something truly staggering. Those loaves had not been forgotten due to the baker's carelessness. The dough was perfectly captured at the exact point of its second fermentation. They were rising in the oven, gaining volume and texture, in the exact second that the city's clock was stopped. For the chemistry of food to be paralyzed in this way, without the dough collapsing or burning in a conventional manner, it required an event of incomprehensible force and speed. Studies point out that the pyroclastic flow, a dense and heavy cloud of poisonous gases and ash, slammed into the bakery's walls, raising the temperature to 572 degrees Fahrenheit in a flash. There was no time to run. There was not even time to understand what was happening outside. The baker closed the iron door, firmly believing that he would return in half an hour to take out his goods. He never opened that door again. The extreme heat sterilized the environment, sucked out all the oxygen in a matter of seconds, and sealed the structure. It turned a simple bread oven into an unbreakable time capsule. We usually look at great historical disasters through cold statistics or through the grandiose accounts of emperors and generals of the time. But the true dimension of a collapse is found right here, in the simplest, most everyday detail of human existence. Bread is the ultimate symbol of normality. The man who bakes the bread believes blindly in tomorrow. The man who kneads the dough early in the morning has the absolute certainty that there will be a late afternoon to feed his family. The oven of Modestus is our starting point because it establishes a terrifying truth. Pompeii was not a city waiting for its end. It was a city planning its future, living intensely and completely blind to the abyss that had already opened up beneath its feet. But to understand how an entire population of 11,000 people could ignore the warnings of nature, we cannot look only at the volcano. We need to look at the streets. We need to roll back the hours, leave this oven in the dark once more, and walk through the city in the late afternoon of the 23rd of August. That was the invisible beginning of the tragedy. The late afternoon sun on the 23rd of August casts long shadows over the uneven volcanic cobblestones of Pompeii. The breeze blowing in from the Tyrrhenian Sea brings a temporary relief from the heavy heat, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of a city wrapping up its workday. The metal of the blacksmith stops ringing in the workshops. The voices in the great markets begin to fade, and the weight of the day slowly dissipates. For the 11,000 inhabitants walking through these narrow streets, this is just the closing of another ordinary cycle. In the normal tired faces of the people returning to their homes, there is not a single trace of apprehension. There are no suspicious glances at the sky or murmurs of fear in the corners. The atmosphere is one of absolute tranquility, built upon centuries of dominance, strong commerce, and the engineering of the Roman Empire. This sense of human control, the feeling that society had mastered the forces of nature, is carved right into the infrastructure around them. Pompeii is not a vulnerable, fragile cluster of mud houses. It is a highly complex urban and architectural marvel. Cold, clean water flows continuously, coming down from the mountains through the massive, imposing Serino Aqueduct. This vital artery splits beneath the streets and feeds, without any daily interruption, 89 public fountains, strategically scattered across every neighborhood and intersection. On the street corners, the constant sound of water overflowing from heavy, carved stone basins acts as the comforting soundtrack of civil security. As the sunlight fades over the horizon, 33 commercial bakeries are already starting to prepare their grains. They quietly organize heavy sacks of flour for the intense labor of the early morning. There is a perfect, predictable social machine turning there, a solid, unquestionable belief that the city will be in the exact same place and in the exact same way tomorrow morning. But the true narrative of the fall of Pompeii does not begin with the sky suddenly turning dark or with the sound of an explosion. The invisible clock of this colossal collapse was triggered much earlier, in the underground darkness, exactly 17 years in the past. In the year 62 AD, the entire Campania region was violently shaken by a massive earthquake. It cracked entire facades, brought down heavy marble columns in the Forum, and destroyed bridges that were vital for trade. That was nature's great, definitive warning. The mountain was waking up from its long slumber. However, what unfolded over the nearly 2 decades that followed was the purest, most tragic display of human stubbornness. Instead of stepping back or abandoning the danger zone, the population simply rebuilt everything. They made even taller temples, more decorated country homes. They imported new marbles and invested fortunes into restoring their estates. Society absorbed the initial shock and moved forward with its eyes closed, turning trauma and fear into a dangerous arrogance. It is exactly in this slow process of adaptation and persistence that the most lethal trap of all resides. Throughout those 17 years, the earth beneath the inhabitants' feet never truly stopped shaking. The small seismic tremors became an integral, ignored, and invisible part of everyone's routine. A goblet of wine that wobbles slightly on a solid wood dining table, the water in a public basin that suddenly ripples without a single gust of wind, the nervous, collective, and seemingly unprovoked barking of dogs in the middle of a quiet night. For wealthy merchants and common laborers alike, these microquakes gradually stopped being seen as signs of imminent danger. They were downgraded to mere daily annoyances. The human mind possesses this terrifying ability to normalize a constant risk until it simply disappears from conscious awareness. The people on the streets just started to mistakenly believe that the earth was merely settling under its own weight. And so, silently, the hands of time tick away the final hours of the night. On the 23rd of August, 5 miles deep, in a dark void, far below the cobblestones where the citizens are resting, the magma chamber reaches its critical, unsustainable limit. The solid rock is being stretched to the absolute point of irreversible rupture, holding back a volatile ocean of superheated magma and toxic gases under colossal pressure. Yet on the surface, the night pushes forward with a serenity that borders on cruel for those looking back from the future. The merchants close the heavy doors of their shops and pull the iron deadbolts. Families gather around the weak, yellow, flickering light of oil lamps. They share the last bread of the day, talk about small trades, and make long-term plans for the weeks ahead. Not a single soul in all of Pompeii looks at the silhouette of the great dark mountain with fear or suspicion. The entire city falls into a deep sleep, lulled by the worst, most definitive of all man-made illusions, the false certainty that tomorrow will always be a guaranteed right. The morning of the 24th of August dawns with a deceptive clarity. As the light sweeps across the terracotta roofs, the city of Pompeii wakes up to fulfill its daily ritual of commerce and survival. There is no panic on the streets. What archaeology shows us about these early hours of sunlight is not a population on the run, but a society engaged in the most dangerous of certainties, the belief that the future is secure. In the Great Forum, the economic and political heart of the region, the merchants open their heavy wooden doors and begin to restock their shelves. Every good put into place, every copper coin exchanged in the early morning hours represented an investment in a tomorrow that would never arrive. We can visualize this relentless routine through deeply intimate details preserved beneath the earth. In one of the busy street food stalls, the famous taverns of the era, archaeologists found 14 large clay amphorae perfectly sealed. They contained the highly sought-after fermented fish sauce, a high-value item in local cuisine. Excavation records indicate that the supplier had just delivered that intact batch. The tavern owner received the product, carefully stored the heavy pieces on the masonry counter, and fully intended to sell them over the coming weeks. It is agonizing to look at these untouched containers today. They prove that, just hours before the end, people were investing their savings and planning their long-term businesses. Normality was an invisible shield, preventing any resident from looking up with suspicion. On the other side of the city, far from the intense clatter of coins and wagons in the Forum, the sound of wooden swords striking against heavy shields echoed through the corridors of the grand amphitheater. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. One of the region's most decorated fighters was sweating under the rising sun, exhaustively repeating his combat drills in the sand. He was an experienced gladiator, a man trained the hard way to anticipate lethal blows and react in fractions of a second to preserve his own life. However, all that rigorous training, all his sharpened ability to read danger was focused solely and exclusively on the arena. He was physically preparing for a major event scheduled for the coming days. The painful irony of this morning is that the most attentive, strategically prepared minds in Pompeii were focused on the wrong opponents. Every step taken on the cobblestones that morning, every door opened, and every delivery made built up a life plan that pushed forward without the slightest question. Families said goodbye after their first meal with the steady confidence of people who are guaranteed to meet again at dinner. Manual laborers took on long tasks. Builders started repairs on high roofs, and our baker was already organizing the fermentation of his dough. The fall of Pompeii earns its true depth, not just from the destructive force of nature, but from the immense vulnerability of our everyday choices. Routine has the power to blind us. It convinces us that absolute control rests firmly in our hands. But while the gladiator trained his reflexes and the merchant stacked his amphorae, the deep magma chamber beneath both their feet was beginning to give way in silence. The city operated in the most perfect order, marching at a steady, punctual pace straight into the darkness. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the illusion of control shatters, not with a boom of mythological proportions, but with a continuous, deafening tear at the top of the mountain. Mount Vesuvius, which for centuries had been nothing but a green, silent backdrop for Roman life, finally releases its contained pressure. A colossal column of superheated rock, poisonous gases, and dark ash is ejected with indescribable violence. It tears through the atmosphere, reaching 9 miles high in a matter of minutes. 18 miles away, across the bay, at the naval base of Misenum, a young scholar named Pliny watches the horizon in pure fascination. He would grab his scrolls and describe that massive cloud as a gigantic pine tree, a thick trunk of smoke that blossomed out into broad dark branches at the very top of the sky, a breathtaking and terrifying sight, documented with absolute precision for all of eternity. But the perspective for those on the streets of Pompeii was drastically different. The bright midday sun began to be swallowed by a thick, unnatural shadow. A sudden, suffocating twilight took over the city. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the air grew heavy, hard to breathe, carrying a strong smell of sulfur that burned the eyes and the throat. The first fine grayish ashes began to fall over the roofs and the squares, floating through the air like a dry, hot, and gloomy snow. And it is in this exact scenario of premature darkness that we face the question that torments historians the most. Why didn't the people just abandon the city immediately? Why did the vast majority of the 11,000 inhabitants remain inside the city limits of Pompeii while the sky fell down? We judge these decisions with the cruel advantage of modern knowledge. But the Romans of the year 79 did not even have the word volcano in their vocabulary. To them, mountains did not explode. The earth shook. Violent storms darkened the day. The gods showed their temporary fury, and then, invariably, normality would return. The instinctive reaction of that population was not a desperate flight into the unknown, but a methodical search for familiar shelter. Merchants gathered and protected their valuable goods. Families called for their children and locked the heavy wooden doors of their homes. They covered their faces with thick fabrics and decided to wait for the dust storm to pass. It was a perfectly logical, well-founded decision for the restricted world they lived in. However, there is an invisible structural detail in this tragedy that completely alters how we read this moment, a relentless omen that sealed everyone's fate. While the population of Pompeii looked up, trying to understand the darkness falling from the sky, the true catastrophe had already solidified beneath their feet. Modern geological data proves that about 4 hours before that massive cloud of smoke blocked out the sun, the underground magma chamber of Vesuvius had suffered a massive internal collapse. The bedrock foundation that supported the mountain's pressure had cracked open in the deep dark. This means that when the first ash touched the ground of Pompeii at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the point of no return had already been crossed in an irreversible way. The city was not just under an atypical volcanic rain, it was at the epicenter of a mechanical chain reaction that was impossible to contain or reverse. The end for those sheltered citizens was not decreed by what they saw falling from the clouds. It was decreed by the structural void that opened up in the depths of the earth hours earlier. It started a lethal countdown that absolutely no one, not even the most prepared minds of the Roman Empire, would be able to decipher in time. 4:30 in the afternoon. The sky over Pompeii visibly no longer exists. In place of the clear blue of late afternoon, an impenetrable, harsh, and suffocating darkness dominates every street, every alley, and every central courtyard of the grand estates. It is in this moment that the tense silence hanging over the trapped city is violently broken by a sharp, heavy, constant sound battering against the clay tiles. It is not an afternoon rain shower. It is the first relentless wave of pumice stone plummeting down on Roman civilization. Porous rock fragments, ranging from 1 to 4 inches in diameter, begin to drop out of the dark clouds with a terrifying speed. They hit the roofs and the historic cobblestones with a deafening noise. a thick, chaotic sound that drowns out any other attempt at communication on the streets. The accumulation rate of this stone storm is truly terrifying. Geological records show us that the city was being buried at a rate of approximately 6 inches per hour. In a very short time, the sidewalks began to disappear under a bumpy gray blanket. The heavy wooden doors of the houses and shops, which once represented the main escape route and free passage for the residents, began to be blocked from the bottom up. The sheer weight of the rocks piling up against the wood made it impossible for anyone to push open their own front door from the inside out. The city was being methodically and cruelly sealed shut. Inside their classic homes, the families of Pompeii faced the moment of greatest despair, isolation, and confusion of their lives, without the sunlight, illuminated only by the trembling and increasingly weak flames of oil lamps fighting for oxygen in an air thick with dust and sulfur. Mothers and fathers look at the tense, terrified faces of their children. They try to find a logical way out that simply doesn't seem to exist. And it is under this extreme psychological pressure, trapped by absolute darkness and the endless noise of rocks destroying the world outside, that the vast majority makes an instinctive decision, a choice that, through the lens of basic human survival, seemed like the most sensible, protective, and natural action possible. They decide to abandon the ground floor, firmly believing that the pileup of volcanic material would invade the front doors through the cracks and trap them in the dark of the main level. Families gather their loved ones and climb the stairs. They seek refuge and safety on the upper floors. They huddle together in the upstairs bedrooms, holding each other in the cold corners, silently waiting for the incomprehensible fury of nature to lose its strength. It is exactly here, at this crucial point in our narrative, at the true climax of this entire story, that we reach the turning point that absolutely changes how we read the final destiny of these people. And investigative archaeology has brought us the dark truth behind this instinctive choice for protection. During the extensive modern excavations, researchers began to notice a disturbing, revealing pattern in the locations of those who failed to get out. The rare residents who decided, whether out of pure stubbornness, advanced age, or total physical inability to move, to remain on the ground floor of their homes, were found under 6 feet of pumice stone. The continuous pressure and colossal weight of this material, falling all afternoon and into the early evening, was relentless. It pressed against doors and sealed off passageways, removing any mathematical chance of escaping on foot. However, the fate of those who climbed the stairs in search of higher shelter was even more severe. It revealed a perfect trap, architected by the mountain itself, from which there was simply no escape. By isolating themselves on the upper floors, strategically closer to the roofs, these families placed themselves directly in the path of the imminent structural collapse. The heavy terracotta tiles, masterfully designed and installed by the Romans to withstand only the heavy winter rains of the Campania region, were never built to hold up tons of accumulated rocks. As the hours painfully dragged on through the night, the weight on top of the houses became completely unsustainable. The thick wooden beams supporting the roofs began to violently crack under the extreme tension, giving way inch by inch. The false sense of security on the second floor morphed into the worst conceivable scenario. The ceilings caved in abruptly over the upstairs rooms, and for those individuals who somehow managed to endure the overwhelming trauma of the structural collapse, bravely holding on amid the choking dust through the long hours of the early morning, the clock still struck its final, definitive blow. 12 hours after that fateful decision to climb the stairs in search of salvation, the final volcanic wave would sweep through the city, striking the unprotected upper areas head on. This is the true heavy essence of the disappearance of Pompeii. It was not an instantaneous collapse, where the end comes without warning. It was an agony built over long hours of brutal uncertainty, where every little decision that seemed unquestioningly correct, every desperate, logical, and profoundly human attempt to protect the ones they loved, only locked in the inescapable outcome even tighter. The 25th of August, 6:30 in the morning. The darkness over Pompeii is absolute, broken only by the reddish flashes of electrical storms generated by the ash column itself. The families who survived the collapse of the roofs are still huddled in the dark, exhausted, covered in fine dust. There is a quiet, human belief that the worst has finally passed, but what is sweeping down the slopes of Mount Vesuvius at this exact moment will wipe out any trace of hope in just 4 minutes. A lethal cloud, known today as a pyroclastic flow, detaches from the mountain. It is not a slow, glowing river of lava, as popular imagination has conditioned us to visualize. Lava never actually reached the streets of Pompeii. What rushes toward the city walls is a heavy avalanche of toxic gases and ash, moving at a terrifying speed of over 60 miles per hour. This dark mass sweeps across the distance, carrying an unbearable temperature of 572 degrees Fahrenheit. This is where archaeology reveals the swiftest and darkest conclusion to this tragedy. When the wall of superheated air invaded the houses, the end did not come from the weight of the falling stones. The deep burial would come later, sealing the scene for the future. What claimed the lives of the inhabitants was a lightning-fast physical process of thermal asphyxiation. The extreme heat sterilized the atmosphere instantly, consuming all the oxygen in a matter of seconds. The cast of 1,150 bodies recovered in the ruins shatter the narrative of a long drawn-out agony. They are not in positions of frantic escape or despair. Their normal postures and facial expressions, immortalized by the excavator's plaster, show the exact moment of someone who tried to draw breath just one single time. They inhaled the atmosphere at nearly 600 degrees, and their time was paralyzed in that exact fraction of a second. The baker, Marcus, and thousands of families were silenced in unison. The entire metropolis met its absolute end, resting on the exact same breath. Today, nearly 2 millennia after that absolute silence, the shadow of Mount Vesuvius continues to stretch over the Campania region. But the landscape around the mountain is not one of isolation. Currently, about 3 million people live within a 12-mile radius of the volcano. This is the official red zone of risk, making it one of the most densely populated volcanic areas on the entire planet. The mountain's last major activity occurred in the year 1944, leaving deep scars in recent memory. We have built our modern world on the exact same premise that guided those ancient inhabitants, the illusion of continuous control. Today, the magma chamber breathes just 5 miles beneath the surface, continuously monitored by 600 high-precision seismic sensors. The authorities' current evacuation plan banks on a 72-hour warning window to pull the population out safely. Our civilization places absolute, unrestricted trust in our instruments and in our technological capacity to master the timing of nature. Yet when we look at this massive, contemporary confidence, it is impossible not to cast our thoughts back to that old stone oven. The baker who closed the iron door on that clear morning also possessed a blind faith in his own time. He believed he would have the necessary hours to come back and finish his work. The true lesson crystallized by the rock is not about a geological abyss, but rather about the silent, fragile nature of tomorrow. How many hours did that ordinary worker really have between the first ignored tremor and his last untouched batch of bread? The inescapable weight of history proves to us that great catastrophes rarely ever send out advance warnings. Everything simply happens while society is distracted by its normal, everyday life. I am immensely grateful to you for walking alongside us through these ancient streets, all the way to the end of this documentary. If this narrative brought value to you, please leave your thoughts in the comments, because we read and love to reply to every single one. Subscribe to follow our upcoming historical investigations. Until our next encounter.